In 1894, one of New York's largest newspapers published an unbelievable claim. It reported that oysters had become so scarce that people were beginning to fear they might disappear forever. To modern readers, that hardly sounds surprising. Oysters are now considered an expensive luxury, served in fine restaurants alongside champagne and silver cutlery. But to someone living in the 19th century, that headline would have sounded almost impossible. Because for thousands of years, oysters were not rare at all. They were everywhere. There were so many oysters covering coastlines around the world that sailors described entire bays as underwater cities built from shells. Some reefs stretched for hundreds of miles, rising so high from the seabed that ships had to navigate around them. Rivers emptied into oceans through forests of oysters. Fish hid among them, birds fed above them. Entire ecosystems depended on them, and human civilization did too. The real history of oysters is not the story of an expensive seafood. It is the story of survival, trade, empire, environmental disaster, and one of the greatest transformations any food has ever experienced. Long before oysters became a delicacy for the wealthy, they helped ordinary people survive the harshest periods of human history. The journey begins long before the first city was built. More than 100,000 years ago, early humans lived along coastlines where every day was a struggle to find enough food. Hunting large animals was dangerous and unpredictable. A successful hunt could feed a family for days, but failure often meant hunger. The sea, however, offered something different. When the tide moved out, thousands of oysters were left within easy reach. Unlike deer or wild cattle, oysters never ran away. They required no weapons, no traps, and no dangerous chase. Entire families could collect enough food simply by walking along the shoreline with baskets in their hands. It was one of the easiest sources of protein the prehistoric world had ever known. Archaeologists have discovered enormous shell middens, ancient piles of discarded oyster shells, in South Africa, Australia, Japan, Europe, and North America. Some are tens of thousands of years old. These are not just piles of rubbish. They are evidence that oysters became one of humanity's oldest, continuously consumed foods, long before farming or permanent settlements existed. But these shells reveal something even more fascinating. The size of ancient oysters was astonishing. Many were far larger than the oysters found today, growing in clean coastal waters, untouched by pollution or industrial fishing. Nature had created underwater reefs so productive that they could support both wildlife and human communities for countless generations. Then everything changed. Around 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age came to an end and sea levels slowly rose, humans began settling near rivers and coastlines instead of constantly moving from place to place. Villages appeared where oysters were plentiful because reliable food meant people could stay in one location for longer periods. Without realizing it, oysters were helping lay the foundations of civilization. As trade routes expanded, oysters became more than food. Coastal communities discovered that live oysters could survive for days if kept cool and damp. That meant they could be transported inland and traded for stone tools, pottery, salt, and other valuable goods. Long before coins existed, oysters were already becoming part of local economies. The first great civilizations soon noticed their value. Ancient Egyptians harvested oysters from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Although fish remained the primary seafood, oysters appeared on the tables of nobles during special occasions. Transporting fresh shellfish hundreds of kilometers inland required wealth and organization, making oysters an early symbol of status among the elite. But no civilization embraced oysters quite like the ancient Greeks. The Greeks loved the sea, and oysters became part of everyday life. They appeared during festivals, religious ceremonies, and public feasts. Yet oysters played another remarkable role that had nothing to do with eating. When citizens wanted to remove a dangerous politician from power, they scratched that person's name onto broken pieces of oyster shell. If enough people voted against the same individual, that person was forced to leave the city for 10 years. Those broken oyster shells were called ostraca. From that simple political tradition came a word still used around the world today: ostracism. Every time someone is described as being ostracized, the word carries the memory of an ancient oyster shell used in a democratic vote more than 2,000 years ago. But even the Greeks could not match what came next. The Romans transformed oysters from a common food into an obsession. Roman nobles believed oysters were among the finest delicacies the empire could offer. Wealthy families competed to serve the freshest oysters at extravagant banquets, where hundreds of guests gathered to display power and status. Some writers even claimed that the finest oysters came from Britain. Despite the enormous distance they had to travel before reaching Rome, the obvious question was, how? How could fresh oysters survive a journey of over 1,000 miles without refrigeration? The answer would create one of the world's earliest luxury food industries and change the history of oysters forever. The answer was surprisingly simple. Oysters are unlike most seafood. As long as they remain alive, cool and moist, they can survive for days outside the water. Roman merchants quickly realized this and began transporting live oysters across the empire in barrels packed with seaweed. What started as a local delicacy soon became an international trade. One man saw an opportunity before anyone else. Around the 1st century BC, a wealthy Roman entrepreneur named Sergius Orata did something historians still consider revolutionary. Instead of relying entirely on wild oyster reefs, he created one of history's earliest commercial oyster farms. Along the coast of southern Italy, Orata built artificial ponds connected to the sea through carefully designed channels. Young oysters were placed inside these protected waters where they could grow before being harvested for Rome's elite. For perhaps the first time in history, oysters were no longer simply gathered from nature. They were being farmed. Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder praised Orata's methods, describing them as both ingenious and incredibly profitable. Soon, wealthy landowners copied the idea, and oyster farming spread across parts of the empire. Serving oysters at a banquet became more than offering food. It became a public display of wealth, influence, and sophistication. But no empire lasts forever. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the trade networks that supplied fresh oysters across Europe collapsed with it. Roads deteriorated, ports became unsafe, and long-distance commerce almost disappeared. Luxury foods vanished from many royal tables, yet oysters never disappeared. Along Europe's coastlines, fishing communities continued harvesting them exactly as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. For ordinary people, oysters remained one of the cheapest and most reliable foods available. Monasteries collected them during religious fasts because shellfish were considered acceptable when meat was forbidden. Coastal villages depended on them through harsh winters when crops failed. Then, during the Middle Ages, Europe slowly recovered. Cities expanded. Trade returned. Kings and nobles once again searched for foods that demonstrated their status. Oysters naturally found their way back onto royal tables. In England, they became especially popular. By the 16th century, London's growing population consumed astonishing numbers of oysters. Street vendors sold them from wooden carts. Taverns served them with bread and ale. And laborers often ate oysters for breakfast, because they were cheaper than beef or pork. Imagine that for a moment. Today, a single oyster may cost more than an entire breakfast. But hundreds of years ago, oysters were considered the food of the working class. Even William Shakespeare mentioned oysters in several of his plays, proving just how familiar they had become in everyday English life. Across the Atlantic, however, something even more extraordinary was waiting. When European explorers reached the eastern coast of North America, they encountered oyster reefs unlike anything they had ever seen. The Chesapeake Bay alone contained billions upon billions of oysters. Some reefs rose so close to the surface that sailing ships occasionally ran aground on them. Early explorers described waters so clear that the seabed could be seen several meters below, because oysters constantly filtered impurities from the water. Native American communities had depended on these oysters for thousands of years. Massive shell mounds, stretching for kilometers, still stand as evidence of countless generations. Harvesting the bay's incredible abundance, European settlers quickly realized what they had found. By the 18th and 19th centuries, American oysters were feeding entire cities. New York became the oyster capital of the world. Oyster sellers appeared on almost every street. Wealthy businessmen enjoyed them with champagne, while factory workers bought them from roadside stalls for just a few cents. Schools, hospitals, prisons, and even orphanages regularly served oysters. Because they were one of the cheapest sources of protein available, the city produced so many oyster shells that they were crushed to build roads, strengthen buildings, and manufacture lime for construction. It seemed impossible that such an endless resource could ever disappear. But history has a habit of repeating the same mistake. As populations exploded during the Industrial Revolution, demand grew faster than nature could recover. Steam-powered dredging machines scraped entire oyster reefs from the seabed. Rivers became polluted by factories and untreated sewage. Forests were cleared upstream, sending huge amounts of mud into coastal waters where oysters struggled to survive. For centuries, reefs that had taken thousands of years to form were destroyed in only a few decades. By the late 19th century, scientists and fishermen began sounding the alarm. The seemingly endless oyster beds were vanishing. The luxury food once enjoyed by Roman emperors, medieval kings, and ordinary laborers was beginning its final transformation. By the end of the 19th century, the impossible had happened. For thousands of years, people believed oyster reefs could never disappear. Every generation assumed the sea would simply produce more. But after centuries of relentless harvesting, pollution, and industrial expansion, nature had finally reached its limit. Entire oyster reefs were gone. The Chesapeake Bay, once home to the largest oyster population on Earth, had lost nearly all of its historic reefs. Rivers that had once been so clear that sailors could see the bottom became dark and polluted. Without billions of oysters filtering the water every single day, algae spread rapidly. Oxygen levels dropped, fish populations declined, and ecosystems that had taken thousands of years to develop began collapsing before human eyes. For the first time, scientists realized that oysters were far more than just seafood. They were engineers of the ocean. A single adult oyster can filter dozens of liters of water every day, removing algae, bacteria, and microscopic particles. Multiply that by millions, and an oyster reef becomes one of nature's most powerful water purification systems. The disappearance of oysters wasn't just a food crisis, it was an environmental disaster. Governments, marine biologists, and conservationists knew something had to change. If humanity continued harvesting oysters the same way, future generations might never see healthy oyster reefs again. Ironically, the solution came from an idea that had existed nearly 2,000 years earlier. The Romans had experimented with oyster farming. Now modern science would perfect it. Instead of collecting every oyster from the wild, hatcheries began raising young oysters in carefully controlled environments. Tiny oyster larvae were protected during the most vulnerable stage of their lives, before being transferred into specially designed coastal farms. There, farmers monitored water quality, temperature, salinity, and disease, while allowing oysters to grow naturally. This approach protected wild populations while still supplying restaurants and markets around the world. Today, most oysters sold commercially are farmed rather than harvested from natural reefs. It is considered one of the world's most sustainable forms of seafood production, because healthy oyster farms actually improve water quality instead of damaging it. But oysters possess another secret that has fascinated humanity for thousands of years. Sometimes, an oyster creates a pearl. Ancient civilizations had no idea how pearls formed. Some believed they were tears from the gods. Others believed they were drops of moonlight trapped inside the sea. The truth, however, is even more remarkable. When a tiny grain of sand or another foreign particle enters certain species of oysters, the animal protects itself by covering the irritant with microscopic layers of a smooth material called nacre, layer after layer, year after year. A pearl slowly begins to grow. Although only a small number of oysters produce valuable pearls, this natural process eventually created one of history's most valuable luxury industries. From the royal courts of Persia and Rome to the palaces of Europe and Asia, pearls became symbols of beauty, power, and wealth. Yet despite producing treasures worth fortunes, the oyster itself nearly disappeared, because people valued what it gave more than the creature that produced it. Thankfully, attitudes began to change during the 20th century. Scientists stopped asking only how many oysters could be harvested. They began asking how many could be saved. That single shift in thinking changed everything. Across North America, Europe, Australia, and Asia, enormous restoration projects began rebuilding ancient oyster reefs. Millions of young oysters were returned to rivers and coastlines where their ancestors had once thrived. Some projects even recycled shells from restaurants, placing them back into coastal waters to provide a foundation where new oysters could grow naturally. Slowly, very slowly, nature began healing itself. The comeback is far from complete. Many historic oyster reefs have disappeared forever, but others are showing remarkable signs of recovery, proving that when humans choose conservation over exploitation, even ecosystems pushed to the edge of collapse can begin to recover. And perhaps that is the greatest twist in the entire history of oysters. For more than 100,000 years, oysters helped humanity survive. Now, humanity is finally learning how to return the favor. Today, if you walk into one of the world's finest restaurants, you'll probably find oysters resting on crushed ice, served with lemon, mignonette sauce, or a glass of champagne. Diners pay extraordinary prices for something that, for most of human history, people could collect with nothing more than their bare hands. It is one of the greatest reversals in the history of food. For thousands of years, oysters were the meal of fishermen, dock workers, laborers, prisoners, and poor families. They were so common that people barely thought about them. Entire cities survived on oysters because they were cheaper than meat and easier to find than almost any other source of protein. Today, the exact opposite is true. The wild oyster reefs that once covered coastlines across Europe and North America have largely disappeared. What was once endless has become precious. Scarcity transformed an ordinary food into a luxury product, but price is only a small part of the story. Modern scientists now believe oyster reefs are among the most important ecosystems on Earth. They protect coastlines from storms, reduce coastal erosion, provide shelter for hundreds of marine species, and naturally filter enormous amounts of seawater every single day. In other words, oysters don't just live in the ocean. They help keep the ocean alive. That understanding has inspired one of the largest marine restoration efforts in history. Across the United States, Europe, Australia, and Asia, conservation groups are rebuilding reefs that vanished decades ago. Millions of recycled oyster shells from restaurants are returned to the sea every year, creating new foundations where young oysters can attach and grow. Some rivers that were once declared biologically dead are slowly beginning to recover. It is a reminder that nature, when given a chance, possesses an extraordinary ability to heal. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire journey is that oysters never changed. Humans did. The same oyster that prehistoric families gathered during low tide, the same oyster served at Roman banquets, the same oyster sold on the streets of London and New York, the same oyster that nearly disappeared because of human greed, is still the oyster we eat today. What changed was the way we saw it. History is full of foods that traveled across continents, changed cultures, and shaped civilizations. But very few foods can claim they helped humans survive before agriculture, influenced ancient democracies, built international trade networks, inspired one of the world's first aquaculture industries, nearly vanished because of industrialization, and finally became a global symbol of luxury. Oysters did all of that, and perhaps that is why their story deserves to be remembered, because this isn't just the history of a shellfish. It's the history of humanity's relationship with nature itself. Again and again, civilizations have discovered resources that seemed limitless. Again and again, they consumed them without imagining they could ever disappear. And again, history proved otherwise. Oysters are one of the clearest examples of that lesson. They remind us that abundance is never guaranteed, that every ecosystem has limits, and that protecting nature is far easier than rebuilding it after it has been lost. So the next time you see an oyster served on a plate, remember, you are not simply looking at seafood. You are looking at a survivor, a creature that has lived through ice ages, the rise and fall of empires, global exploration, industrial revolutions, environmental collapse, and modern conservation. Very few foods can tell a story stretching back more than 100,000 years. Oysters can. And perhaps that is the greatest reason they remain one of the most extraordinary foods in human history. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which food's hidden history you'd like to explore next. Because sometimes the most ordinary things on our plates have the most extraordinary stories behind them.